Neptune Beach, Florida, presents itself as the quintessential coastal sanctuary, a satellite community of Jacksonville where the Atlantic breeze usually sweeps away the grime of the big city. In 2017, the single-story, beige, stucco house on Seagate Avenue was meant to be a fortress of stability for 3 generations of the Mott family. From the outside, the residence projected the disciplined order expected of its owner, Eric Mott, a veteran corrections lieutenant with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. The lawn was manicured, the vehicles were parked with precision, and the windows remained shut against the humid Florida heat. Inside, however, the architecture of the family unit was far more complex, held together by a fragile suspension of duty, medical necessity, and the lingering scars of a contentious past. At the head of this household stood Eric Mott. A man defined by the rigid structures of law enforcement, Eric had spent 17 years climbing the ranks of the Department of Corrections. His world was one of clear demarcations between right and wrong, order and chaos. He served as a firearms instructor and a chaotic incident commander, roles that required a psyche attuned to threat assessment and control. This professional demeanor inevitably bled into his domestic life. He was a single father who loved his son deeply but parented with the authoritative presence of a man accustomed to command. His shift work, often keeping him away during the night or sleeping during the day, necessitated a support system that could not fail. That support system was Christina French. At 53 years old, Christina was not merely a grandmother occupying a guest room. She was the operational backbone of the Seagate Avenue home. With short, sensible blonde hair and a demeanor described by friends as radiating warmth, she served as the counterweight to Eric's stoicism. Professionally, she worked as the director of operations for the May Institute, an organization dedicated to serving individuals with autism and other developmental disabilities. Her career was built on patience and empathy, traits she applied liberally to her grandson, Logan. When Eric and Logan's mother divorced, it was Christina who stepped into the breach, moving in to ensure that the domestic machinery kept running. She cooked the meals, managed the schedules, and provided the maternal softness that the household otherwise lacked. She was the buffer zone, the confidant, and the primary caregiver for a teenager with significant medical needs. Logan Mott, at 15 years old, was a phantom of a boy. To the casual observer, he appeared much younger, often mistaken for a 13 or 14-year-old due to his slight build, pale complexion, and shock of red hair that swept across his forehead. He wore wire-rimmed glasses that accentuated an aesthetic of harmless intelligence. In the halls of Sandalwood High School, Logan navigated the freshman social landscape as a ghost quiet, polite, and academically driven. He was a cadet in the school's Air Force JROTC program, a detail that aligned perfectly with his father's paramilitary background. He played chess. He was courteous to teachers and rarely drew attention to himself. By every external metric available to the Neptune Beach community, Logan was the good kid. He was the antithesis of the troubled adolescent stereotype. He did not run with gangs, he did not have a record of truancy, and his neighbors viewed him as a gentle, somewhat introverted shadow trailing behind his father and grandmother. However, Logan's life was governed by a biological dictator. Type 1, diabetes. Diagnosed at a young age, the condition required constant, invasive vigilance. It was not a casual ailment, but a relentless physiological tether that bound him to the adults in his life. His blood sugar levels dictated his mood, his energy, and his very survival. He wore an insulin pump, a device that served as a constant reminder of his physical vulnerability. This medical reality created a dynamic of enforced intimacy between Logan and Christina. She was the one who often monitored his levels, ensured he ate correctly, and watched for the lethargy or irritability that signaled a hypoglycemic crash. While necessary, this dependency created a friction common in adolescents with chronic illnesses, but amplified by the specific tensions of the Mott household. For a teenage boy yearning for autonomy, the disease was a leash. Every meal was a negotiation. Every physical sensation was subject to adult scrutiny. The insulin pump was a visible symbol of his inability to be truly independent. Eric Mott, with his law enforcement training, approached the diabetes with the same tactical precision he applied to his job. It was a problem to be managed through discipline and routine. There was little room for teenage rebellion when a skipped meal or a forgotten bolus could result in hospitalization. Consequently, Logan's rebellion had to go inward, festering behind the polite smile and the "yes, sir" responses he offered the world. The pressure cooker of the Seagate Avenue residence was further pressurized by the history of Logan's parents. The divorce between Eric Mott and Carrie Campbell Mott had been neither swift nor amicable. It was a scorched earth separation that left emotional craters in the landscape of Logan's childhood. The custody battle had been fierce, filled with the kind of vitriol that forces children to choose sides. Ultimately, Eric had won primary custody, bringing Logan to Florida, while Carrie resided in Missouri. This geographical separation created a narrative rift in Logan's life. In the years leading up to 2017, the relationship between Logan and his mother existed primarily through digital channels and scheduled visits, a fragmented connection that stood in stark contrast to the daily regimentation of life with his father. The divorce decree and the subsequent parenting plans were legal documents, but for Logan, they were the walls of his cage. There were reports and whispers of the boy feeling unheard, a pawn moved across state lines by judicial orders rather than his own desires. The good kid persona he adopted in Neptune Beach may have been a survival mechanism, a way to navigate his father's strict expectations while suppressing the confusion and resentment stemming from the family breakup. Eric Mott's home was also a fortress in a literal sense. As a firearms instructor, he kept weapons in the house. They were tools of his trade, treated with respect and stored according to safety protocols. Logan, through his ROTC involvement and his father's tutelage, was familiar with firearms. He knew how to handle them, how to respect them, and crucially, where they were kept. This proximity to lethal force was normalized within the household culture. It was not unusual for a police household to contain guns, but combined with the silent, simmering psychological pressure building within the teen, the presence of these weapons added a latent danger to the environment. The structure that Eric provided, the discipline, the JROTC, the focus on responsibility, was intended to build character. It was meant to mold Logan into a responsible young man who could manage his diabetes and his future. But structure without an emotional outlet can become a prison. The dynamic between Logan and Christina was perhaps the most tragic element of this domestic tableau. By all accounts, she loved him ferociously. She had upended her own life to help raise him. Yet, in the binary world of a teenager perceiving persecution, the caregiver can easily morph into the jailer. Because she was the one present while Eric worked, she was the primary enforcer of the rules. She was the one ensuring the homework was done, the room was clean, and the insulin was administered. The closeness of their relationship meant she was the nearest target for any displaced aggression Logan felt toward his father or his medical condition. They were a team of two for long stretches of time, isolated within the quiet walls of the Seagate Avenue home. Socially, the family projected an image of resilience. They were the survivors of the divorce, the father and son making it work with the help of the devoted grandmother. They took vacations together. They attended school functions. Photos from this era show a smiling, bespectacled boy flanked by the two adults who structured his entire existence. There was no record of police calls to the home for domestic disturbances. There were no outbursts at school that signaled a violent pathology. Logan's teachers praised his intellect. His chess opponents respected his strategy. The nurses at the school clinic knew him as a compliant patient who managed his condition well. Beneath the surface, however, the tectonic plates of the family dynamic were grinding. The transition to high school is a volatile period for any adolescent, but for Logan, it coincided with a deepening sense of entrapment. The resentment toward his father's rigid authority, the frustration with his mother's absence, and the exhaustion of managing a chronic illness created a perfect storm of internal conflict. He was a boy living two lives, the visible life of the ROTC cadet and dutiful grandson, and a hidden life of digital escapism and dark ideation. The house on Seagate Avenue was quiet. The routine was set. Eric went to work, protecting the city. Christina managed the home, protecting Logan. And Logan waited, watching the adults who controlled his world, his demeanor betraying nothing of the cataclysm that was about to unravel the carefully curated life of the Mott family. The diabetic supplies were stocked, the uniforms were pressed, and the guns were in the safe, all components of a life that looked perfect on paper, right up until the moment it wasn't. The house on Seagull Drive became a pressure cooker of unspoken grievances and rigid enforcement. While the exterior of the Neptune Beach property suggested a standard, quiet suburban existence, the atmosphere inside was rapidly deteriorating as 2017 progressed. Logan's sophomore year at Sandalwood High School, which had begun with the promise of continued success in the JROTC program, quickly devolved into a series of disciplinary crises that shattered the illusion of the disciplined cadet. The regimented structure that had once provided him with a sense of purpose now felt like a cage, and he began testing the bars with increasing recklessness. The first major fracture in Logan's facade appeared within the school corridors. Administrators, who had previously viewed him as a quiet and compliant student, were alerted to a disturbing transgression. Logan was caught in possession of alcohol on school grounds. For a 15-year-old managing a complex autoimmune disease like type 1 diabetes, the introduction of alcohol was physically dangerous, but legally and academically, it was a severe infraction. The incident blindsided Eric Mott. As a corrections lieutenant with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, Eric operated within a world of strict binary codes, right and wrong, law and order. The idea that his own son, whom he had raised with military-style discipline, was engaging in delinquent behavior, was not just a parenting challenge, but a personal affront to the values he upheld professionally. Before the dust could settle on the alcohol incident, a far more serious violation occurred. Logan was discovered bringing a knife to school. In the post-Columbine era of zero-tolerance policies, this was catastrophic. The weapon was not merely a pocket knife for utility, but was perceived as a threat to the safety of the student body. The administration's response was swift and non-negotiable. Logan was expelled from Sandalwood High School. The expulsion effectively severed him from his social circle, his JROTC routine, and the few positive external validations he had left. He was transferred to a magnet program, a move that felt less like a fresh start and more like a punitive exile. The consequences at home were immediate and severe. Eric Mott responded to his son's delinquency with the tools he knew best. He implemented a lockdown protocol within their shared living space. The primary objective was to strip away distractions and force Logan to confront his behavior. Eric confiscated Logan's electronics, cutting off his lifeline to the digital world where he spent the majority of his time. For a teenager in 2017, the loss of a smartphone and internet access was a form of social death, isolating him further in his own headspace. But the discipline went beyond the confiscation of property. In a move designed to eliminate privacy and ensure constant supervision, Eric removed the door to Logan's bedroom. The sanctuary of a teenager's room is often the only place they feel a sense of autonomy, and by taking the door off its hinges, Eric dismantled that boundary. Logan was exposed. Every movement, every moment of rest, was subject to the gaze of his father. The physical alteration of the house mirrored the psychological state of their relationship, open, raw, and devoid of trust. The tension was exacerbated by the daily medical necessities of Logan's life. Eric was deeply involved in the management of Logan's diabetes, a role that required constant monitoring of blood sugar levels and insulin intake. What should have been a caregiving dynamic became another arena for control and conflict. Logan's rebellion began to bleed into his health management. He neglected his levels, using his own body as a battleground to assert independence from his father's oversight. Eric, terrified for his son's health and furious at the negligence, clamped down harder. The cycle was self-perpetuating. The stricter the control, the more desperate the rebellion. Friends and family began to notice the shift. Logan, who had always been described as polite and somewhat shy, appeared increasingly withdrawn. The polite veneer was cracking, revealing glimpses of a simmering anger. He made off-putting comments that hinted at a darkening worldview. He expressed fascinations with ideologies that stood in stark contrast to his father's service background, flirting with political extremism and violent imagery in his private journals and limited conversations. These were not merely teenage affectations but warning flares of a psyche under siege. Eric's girlfriend, who was part of the household dynamic, witnessed the escalating friction. The home was no longer a place of rest for anyone. It was a zone of containment. Logan was grounded, stripped of privileges, and watched constantly. He spent his days in a room without a door, seething in the hallway light, surrounded by the silence of his confiscations. He began stealing small items, testing boundaries in petty ways. He raided the liquor cabinet again, seeking the numbing agent he had been caught with at school. He took small knives, hiding them away, perhaps as totems of power in a life where he felt he had none. As November approached, the friction point arrived in the form of a planned vacation. Eric and his girlfriend had scheduled a trip, a getaway that had likely been on the books before Logan's life went off the rails. The question of what to do with Logan was complicated. He could not be trusted to stay alone. His recent expulsion and the theft of alcohol proved he lacked the maturity and stability for self-supervision. Furthermore, he was effectively grounded, serving a sentence for his school infractions. Taking him along on a vacation was out of the question. It would be a reward for bad behavior, contradicting Eric's disciplinary philosophy. The solution lay with Christina French. At 53 years old, Christina was the maternal anchor of the family. She was Logan's paternal grandmother, a woman described by everyone who knew her as a beacon of kindness and generosity. She worked with the street John's Riverkeeper, dedicating her time to environmental protection and charity. She was a woman of deep faith and endless patience, the cool grandma, who provided a soft landing when the world became too hard. She adored Logan. To her, he was not the troubled delinquent or the expelled student. He was her grandson, a boy she had helped raise, a boy who was struggling and needed love, not just law. Christina agreed to watch Logan while Eric went on his trip. The plan was logistical and practical. She would stay at the Seagull Drive house to ensure Logan maintained his insulin regimen, attended his new school, and stayed out of trouble. It was viewed as a safe arrangement. Christina was family. She was trusted. She had a close bond with Logan, one that was free of the combative alpha dynamic that existed between him and his father. It was hoped that her gentle influence might reach him in a way that Eric's strictness could not. In the days leading up to the trip, the atmosphere in the Mott household was thick with unspoken resentment. Logan watched his father pack. He watched the preparations for a leisure trip he was excluded from, a physical manifestation of his outcast status. The rejection stung. It reinforced the narrative in his head that he was a problem to be managed, a burden to be handed off. The removal of the bedroom door remained a gaping wound in the hallway, a constant reminder of his lack of status. Eric, for his part, likely viewed the arrangement with relief. He needed a break from the constant vigilance, the relentless arguments, and the stress of managing a defiant teenager who seemed hell-bent on self-destruction. Leaving Logan with Christina was the responsible choice. She was capable, she was loving, and she was the only person Logan seemed to tolerate without open hostility. Eric left specific instructions regarding Logan's care, his restrictions, and his medical needs. The hierarchy was clear. Christina was the proxy authority. However, the dynamic between a grandmother and a grandson is fundamentally different from that of a father and son. Christina's authority was rooted in affection, not force. She did not operate like a corrections officer. She did not rule through intimidation. As the departure date for Eric's vacation arrived, the house on Seagull Drive underwent a subtle shift. The authoritarian enforcer was leaving the building. The rigid structure that held Logan's impulses in check was about to be replaced by a softer, more permeable supervision. Logan was acutely aware of this transition. He knew the rules would soften. He knew that while his father could physically overpower him and mentally outmaneuver him, his grandmother was smaller, kinder, and trusting. The fear of immediate consequence, which Eric instilled through his very presence, would evaporate the moment Eric's car pulled out of the driveway. On the surface, the handover seemed routine. Eric finalized his packing, issued his last warnings to Logan, and expressed his gratitude to his mother. Christina arrived, ready to settle in for a few days of grandson sitting. She brought her warmth into the cold, sterile environment Eric had enforced. She likely planned meals, hoped for conversations, and intended to offer Logan a reprieve from the hostility of the past few months. She did not see a monster, she saw a boy who had lost his way. But Logan was no longer just a boy who had lost his way. The months of isolation, the public humiliation of the expulsion, and the seething resentment toward his father had coalesced into something far darker. He had been visualizing violence. He had been harboring fantasies of escape and retribution. The discipline intended to break his rebellious streak had instead calcified it into a cold, hard resolve. When Eric Mott departed for his vacation, he believed he had secured the perimeter. He believed the combination of the lack of electronics, the house rules, and his mother's supervision would maintain the status quo until his return. He did not realize that by removing the pressure of his own presence, he wasn't defusing the bomb, he was removing the safety pin. The house was now occupied only by a woman who saw the best in people and a teenager who had decided to embrace his worst. The silence that settled over the home after Eric left was not peaceful. It was expectant. Logan was now alone with the one person who stood between him and his desires. Christina represented the last line of defense, the final barrier to the freedom he felt he was owed. She was the gatekeeper. But unlike his father, she did not hold the keys to the cell with an iron grip. She held them with an open hand. As the first night of the arrangement set in, the ordinary domestic rhythms resumed. Dinner was made, insulin was checked, but the undercurrent had shifted. Logan was navigating a new calculus. The stolen knives were still hidden in his possession. The resentment over the stolen vacation and the humiliation of the doorless room churned in his mind. The downward spiral of 2017 had reached its nadir. All the safeguards, school, JROTC, father, fear were gone. All that remained in the house on Seagull Drive was a grandmother's trust and a grandson's betrayal waiting to unfold. The trap was set, not by a criminal mastermind, but by a convergence of teenage angst, mental instability, and a family trying desperately to fix a broken boy, unaware that he was already beyond repair. The silence inside the Seagate Avenue residence on the night of the 22nd of November 2017 was not the peaceful quiet of a suburban evening, but the heavy, pressurized stillness of a vessel about to rupture. Outside, Neptune Beach was settling into the dark, cool rhythm of late autumn in Florida, the streets empty and the neighbors retreated into their homes. Inside, the air was thick with the unsaid. Christina French, 53 years old, and operating with the devoted, if somewhat weary, intent of a grandmother entrusted with a difficult task, moved through the house with a routine familiarity. She was the interim guardian, the buffer between Logan Mott and a world his father, Eric, had tried desperately to structure for him. With Eric away on vacation, a trip that Logan had bitterly resented being excluded from, the house felt less like a home and more like a holding cell. Logan, 15 years old but cursed with a face that looked years younger, moved through the rooms like a ghost haunting his own life. The resentment over the vacation, the feeling of being left behind, discarded, and managed like a problem rather than a son had metastasized into a cold, hard knot in his chest. He was insulin dependent, a condition that required constant monitoring, a tether that kept him permanently attached to adult supervision. Christina was the enforcer of this medical necessity. She checked his levels, asked about his food, and monitored his schedule. To an ordinary teenager, this was care. To Logan, in the darker corridors of his mind on that Wednesday night, it was surveillance. The evening hours ticked by with agonizing slowness. The dynamic between grandmother and grandson had shifted from familial affection to a strained, transactional relationship. Logan was armed, not just with the knives he had secretly squirreled away, but with a growing, dangerous detachment from reality. He had been struggling with depression and agitation, moods that swung like a pendulum in the dark. Tonight, the pendulum had stuck at the apex of rage. There was no screaming match that neighbors could hear, no shattering of glass that alerted the street. The violence that was brewing was internal, a silent accumulation of perceived slights and profound isolation. Sometime after the sun had set, the friction point was reached. The specific trigger remains buried in the chaotic neurology of the teenager's brain, but the forensic aftermath painted a clear picture of the explosion. It likely began with a confrontation, perhaps over something as trivial as a phone, a bedtime, or a tone of voice. Christina, standing her ground as the guardian, became the target of a fury that had little to do with her and everything to do with the authority she represented. She was the nearest available object for a boy looking to destroy the boundaries of his existence. The attack, when it came, was sudden and overwhelming. It did not possess the hesitant, fumbling quality of an accident or a moment of panic. It was a release. In the living space of the home, the threshold was crossed. Logan Mott, the boy who had been described by teachers as quiet and by family as troubled, unleashed a level of violence that stood in stark contrast to his slight physical stature. He produced a knife. The distance between them closed. The stabbing was the first act of the tragedy. It was intimate and brutal, a method of killing that requires physical proximity and force. Christina French, a woman who had spent her days caring for the sick and the elderly, who had devoted herself to her grandson's well-being, found herself fighting for her life against him. The blade inflicted severe trauma, breaking the sanctity of the domestic space. Blood was shed on the floor where they had walked, talked, and existed as family. The physical reality of the assault was chaotic. Defensive wounds would later suggest she tried to protect herself, tried to stop the child she loved from completing the unthinkable. But the boy who attacked her had dissociated from that love. He was operating on a different frequency, one where she was no longer his grandmother, but an obstacle to be removed. The knife was not enough to satiate the urge, or perhaps not efficient enough to end the struggle. The violence escalated to a second, more final phase. The home contained firearms, tools of his father's profession as a corrections officer, weapons that were supposed to be secured but were accessible to a motivated insider. Logan retrieved a gun. The transition from the visceral, close-contact violence of the knife to the mechanical lethality of the firearm marked a shift in the psychology of the moment. He was not just lashing out, he was finishing the job. He fired. The gunshot cracked through the air of the enclosed house, a deafening finality that severed the last tie to his childhood. Christina French fell. The silence that rushed back into the room was absolute. The struggle was over. The grandmother who had been the gatekeeper was gone, reduced to a tragic stillness on the floor of her son's home. In the immediate aftermath, as the echo of the shot faded, one might expect a 15-year-old boy to collapse under the weight of what he had done. Panic, tears, a frantic call to 911. These are the reactions of a child who has made a terrible mistake. But Logan Mott did not panic. The psychological state of the teenager in those minutes following the murder is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the night. He stood amidst the carnage of his own making and did not flee in terror. Instead, he began to think with a pragmatic, icy logic. The problem now was not the emotional weight of matricide, but the physical presence of the body. He needed to hide what he had done. The boy who had moments ago been a killer now became a cleaner. He navigated the house, the scene of the crime, with a disturbing sense of purpose. He had to move her. Christina was not a large woman, but the dead weight of a human body is difficult to maneuver. He dragged her, moving her from the site of her death, through the house, and out into the darkness of the backyard. The backyard of the Seagate Avenue home was fenced, private, a patch of suburbia usually reserved for grilling or relaxation. Under the cover of the November night, it became a burial ground. Logan retrieved a shovel. The physical exertion required to dig a grave in the Florida soil is significant. It takes time. It takes rhythm. For a diabetic teenager, it consumes energy. Yet he dug. He created a shallow grave, a hollow in the earth just deep enough to conceal the evidence of his crime. He placed his grandmother into the ground and covered her. The act was completed not with ceremony, but with the desperate efficiency of concealment. Back inside the house, the reality of the scene had to be erased. He attempted to clean the blood. He wiped surfaces. He tried to sanitize the environment, to reset the stage, so that the play could continue for just a little while longer. His mind was already projecting forward, plotting the next steps of his escape. He was not waiting for his father to return and punish him. He was planning to vanish. He moved through the rooms, gathering supplies. This was not the packing of a runaway child taking a backpack of clothes. This was the looting of a fugitive. He took his grandmother's purse. He took the keys to her Dodge Dart, the vehicle that would be his chariot to freedom. He went into the gun safe, or wherever the firearms were stored, and took his father's service weapons. He armed himself heavily, taking pistols and ammunition. The boy who had felt powerless was now arguably the most dangerous person in Neptune Beach. His psychological state during these hours suggests a profound dissociation. To kill a family member, bury them in the yard, and then methodically pack bags and steal cars indicates a shutting down of the empathy centers of the brain. He was operating on a survival instinct that had been warped by his resentment. He felt justified, or at least, he felt that the action had been necessary to achieve the autonomy he craved. The text messages would come later, the deceptive digital footprint he would leave to buy time, but on this night, his communication was only with himself. He checked his blood sugar. He likely ate something or took insulin, maintaining the machine of his body even after destroying the woman who had been tasked with maintaining it for him. The juxtaposition of these mundane medical necessities with the atrocity of the murder highlights the compartmentalization in his mind. He could be a diabetic patient and a cold-blooded killer simultaneously. As the night deepened and turned toward the early hours of the next morning, the house on Seagate Avenue held its secrets. The blood had been wiped, though imperfectly. The body was hidden, though shallowly. The weapons were packed. Logan Mott sat in the center of the void he had created. He was alone in the house, truly alone for the first time, unsupervised and unchecked. But the freedom he had seized was an illusion. He was now a prisoner of the act itself. He prepared to leave. He took the keys to the Dodge Dart. He loaded the car with the guns, his supplies, and the stolen alcohol he had found. He was not just leaving the house, he was leaving his identity. He was no longer Logan Mott, the high school student. He was a fugitive heading north, drawn toward the Canadian border by some vague notion of disappearance. The smile that would later appear in court, the smirk that would ignite public outrage, was forged in these hours. It was the expression of a boy who believed he had outsmarted the world, who believed that by removing the gatekeeper, he had opened the gate. He did not yet know that the gate led only to a cage. He stepped out into the cool night air, leaving the house behind. The silence of the neighborhood remained unbroken. No sirens wailed. No lights flickered on in adjacent houses. He got into his grandmother's car, the engine turning over with a soft hum. As he pulled away from the curb, leaving the shallow grave in the rearview mirror, he began the drive that would end in Buffalo. The night of November 22 was over. The crime was complete. The chase had begun, even if no one else knew it yet. The silence that descended upon the Neptune Beach residence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, heavy breathing of a 15-year-old boy faced with a logistical problem. The violence was finished, the adrenaline of the initial confrontation fading into a cold, calculated pragmatism. Logan Mott did not flee immediately. The immediate aftermath required labor, and he set about the task with a disturbing level of composure. The boy, who looked even younger than his years, found himself alone with the body of his grandmother, Christina French, and the reality of the situation dictated his next movements. The house on Seagate Avenue, usually a place of familial safety, had been transformed into a crime scene that needed to be sanitized. Logan turned his attention to the backyard. The Florida soil was sandy and yielding, a small mercy in a night defined by horrors. Under the cover of darkness, shielded by the privacy fences that separated the suburban lots, he began to dig. It was not a deep excavation. The grave he fashioned was shallow, a hasty depression in the earth intended to conceal rather than to honor. The physical exertion required to move Christina French from the interior of the home to the yard was significant. He wrapped her remains, using plastic and bedding to shroud the evidence of the violence inflicted upon her. The process was clumsy, driven by the desperate need to remove the body from the floor plan of the house before his father, Eric Mott, returned from his shift or vacation. Once the body was placed in the shallow trench and covered with the loose sandy dirt, Logan returned to the interior. The house smelled of the metallic tang of blood, a scent he attempted to mask with chemical cleaners. He retrieved bleach and cleaning supplies, scrubbing the areas where the confrontation had occurred. The cleanup was amateurish, leaving behind traces that forensic teams would later identify with ease, but to the naked eye, in the dim light of the evening, it provided a superficial semblance of order. He was erasing the grandmother he had lived with, wiping away the physical biological trail of her existence in that home. He moved with a singular focus, ignoring the emotional weight of the objects around him, family photos, personal effects, the mundane clutter of a shared life. With the primary evidence hidden beneath the backyard soil and the floorboards scrubbed, Logan shifted his focus to acquisition. He needed resources. His plan was not to stay and face the questions that would inevitably arise when Christina failed to answer her phone. His plan was to vanish. He moved to the secure areas of the home where his father, a veteran corrections officer with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, kept his firearms. Logan knew exactly what he was looking for. He seized a Glock 19, a service-grade weapon, along with ammunition. This was the decisive moment where the narrative shifted from a domestic tragedy to a potential rampage. He was no longer just a runaway, but an armed fugitive. He packed a bag, gathering clothing and supplies, treating the house like a supply depot. He took alcohol, perhaps to dull the nerves that were surely vibrating beneath his calm exterior, and he took the keys to Christina's silver Dodge Dart. The vehicle sat in the driveway, a symbol of the mobility he desperately required. He loaded the stolen guns and his supplies into the car. The transformation was complete. He sat in the driver's seat, a place he was legally too young to occupy without supervision, and started the engine. As he pulled away from the house in Neptune Beach, leaving the shallow grave and the bleach-scented rooms behind, he initiated a digital smokescreen that would confuse law enforcement and his family for days. The timeline of his escape was padded by electronic deception. As he drove, putting miles between himself and the crime scene, his phone became a tool of manipulation. His father, Eric Mott, reached out, expecting to hear from his mother or his son. Logan replied. He did not go silent. He engaged. In a series of text messages that chilled investigators in retrospect, Logan adopted a casual, reassuring tone. When asked about his whereabouts or the status of the house, he lied with fluidity. He told his father he was fine. He mentioned being with friends. Crucially, he sent the message that would later haunt the case proceedings. "I'll be home soon." This specific text was a masterstroke of stalling. By claiming he would be returning shortly, he pacified his father's growing anxiety, preventing Eric from rushing home or calling the police immediately to report them missing. It bought Logan hours on the highway. It bought him the time to cross state lines, while the people who loved him believed he was just a typical teenager out past his curfew. The deception required a bifurcated reality. In the digital world, Logan was a safe, slightly rebellious kid just around the corner. In the physical world, he was driving a stolen car north on Interstate 95, armed and dangerous, fleeing a murder. The drive north was a marathon of endurance and paranoia. Florida's palm trees and humidity gave way to the pine forests of Georgia and the Carolinas. The Dodge Dart, a conspicuous piece of evidence, blended into the flow of interstate traffic. Logan managed the vehicle, navigating the complex highway systems despite his lack of driving experience. He stopped only when necessary, using the stolen money to fuel the car and himself. Every stop was a calculated risk. Gas stations were heavily surveyed by security cameras. Convenience stores were brightly lit stages where his face could be captured. Yet, he continued, propelled by a naive belief that distance equated to safety. As the miles accumulated, the landscape shifted. The temperature dropped. He was driving toward the Canadian border, a destination that seemingly represented a reset button. The logic was flawed. Border crossings are among the most heavily policed zones in the world, but in the mind of the 15-year-old, Canada was a sanctuary. He drove through the mid-Atlantic states, the endless ribbon of asphalt stretching out before him. The interior of the car became his entire world, a capsule containing the guns, the alcohol, and the silence of his own thoughts. Back in Neptune Beach, the facade began to crack. The "I'll be home soon" text stopped making sense as hours turned into a day, and then longer. Eric Mott returned to the home to find it empty. The discovery was not immediate. The house appeared intact at first glance. But the absence of Christina and Logan was palpable. The realization that the guns were missing escalated the situation instantly. A missing persons report was filed, which quickly evolved into a manhunt as the details of the scene were processed and the shallow grave in the backyard was eventually discovered. The text messages, once seen as reassurance, were now revealed as the stalling tactics of a killer. Logan, however, was hundreds of miles away, oblivious to the discovery of the body. He had crossed into Pennsylvania and then New York. The psychological strain of the drive must have been immense, yet he kept going. He was navigating by GPS, the blue line on the screen guiding him toward Buffalo. The choice of Buffalo was strategic. It was a gateway to Ontario. The bridge to Canada lay ahead. As he entered New York State, the reality of his fatigue began to set in. He had been driving for an extended period, operating on adrenaline and fear. The Dodge Dart was now a marked vehicle. The All Points Bulletin, APB, had been issued. License plate readers and patrol cars were scanning for the silver sedan. Logan was driving into a funnel. The vast freedom of the open interstate was narrowing into the controlled choke point of the international border. He reached the vicinity of Buffalo. The cold northern air, a stark contrast to the Florida warmth he had left behind. He was a child in a man's game, carrying weapons he had stolen from a law enforcement officer, driving a car belonging to the woman he had buried in the sand. The arrogance that had allowed him to send those texts, to believe he could simply talk his way out of the timeline, was about to collide with the hard infrastructure of federal border protection. He did not make it across the bridge. The capture was not a dramatic high-speed chase, but a stop initiated by U.S. Customs and Border Protection. When they intercepted the Dodge Dart, they didn't find a trembling child. They found Logan Mott, surrounded by the evidence of his flight. The discovery of the knives and the guns in the vehicle confirmed the danger he posed. He was taken into custody, the escape attempt terminated just miles from his goal. The transition from driver to detainee was abrupt. He was pulled from the car, the false narrative he had constructed via text messages finally shattered. He was no longer the boy who would be home soon. He was a suspect in custody, found with the stolen property of a murder victim. The smirk, the attitude that would later enrage the public and the judiciary, began to form in these initial moments of detention. It was a defense mechanism, a mask of indifference worn by a boy who had convinced himself he was smarter than the adults hunting him. He had scrubbed the floor, he had hidden the body, and he had almost made it to a foreign country. In his mind, the failure was a technicality, not a moral reckoning. As he sat in the holding cell in Buffalo, awaiting extradition back to Florida, the gravity of his actions had not yet pierced his armor. He was miles from the sandy grave in Neptune Beach, but the tether remained. The text messages, the stolen guns, and the shallow hole in the yard were the chains that would drag him back. The drive north had been a flight from consequences, but he had merely driven himself directly into the hands of the justice system. The home he had promised to return to was gone. The only structure awaiting him now was a prison cell. The journey of Logan Mott as a free individual had ended on that cold road in New York, and the long, sterile process of judgment was about to begin. The timeline of the investigation shifted abruptly on the 24th of November 2017. Eric Mott, a corrections lieutenant with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, returned to his home on Seagull Drive in Neptune Beach, Florida. He had been away on vacation, expecting to return to the routine domesticity of life with his teenage son, Logan, and his mother, Christina French. The plan had been simple: Christina was staying at the house to watch over Logan while Eric was away. Upon his return, however, the silence that greeted him was the first indication that the routine had been shattered. The house was locked. The driveway was empty. Christina's silver Dodge Dart was missing, a vehicle that should have been parked in its usual spot. Eric entered the residence, calling out for his mother and his son. There was no response. The air inside was stale, holding the quiet of a space that had been uninhabited for some time. He moved through the living areas, checking the bedrooms. The beds were unmade, but not in a way that suggested recent sleep, rather. They looked abandoned. The normal clutter of a teenager's life was present, yet the essential animate force of the household was absent. Eric's concern escalated from annoyance to alarm as he conducted a more thorough sweep of the property. He checked his phone again. No new messages, no missed calls explaining their whereabouts. He had received texts earlier in the week, communications that had assured him everything was fine, but the physical reality of the empty house contradicted those digital assurances. His training as a law enforcement officer kicked in, urging him to look for specific anomalies, things that did not fit the pattern of a simple family outing. He made his way to the area where he kept his firearms. As a lieutenant, he maintained a secure safe for his service weapons and personal guns. When he approached the safe, the dread crystallized. The door was breached. The metal cabinet stood open, its contents raided. Eric conducted a rapid inventory. His service weapon was gone. A Glock 19 was missing. Ammunition had been taken. The realization hit with the force of a physical blow. His mother and son were not just missing. They were missing in the company of lethal weaponry. At this juncture, the narrative was ambiguous. It was unclear if Christina and Logan had been abducted, if they were victims of a home invasion, or if something more complex had occurred. Eric contacted the Neptune Beach Police Department immediately. The call went out as a high-priority missing persons case, with endangered status attached. The endangerment was twofold. Logan Mott was an insulin-dependent diabetic, and without his medication, his life was at risk within days, if not hours. Additionally, the presence of missing firearms escalated the potential danger to the public and the missing individuals themselves. Police units arrived at Seagull Drive within minutes. The quiet residential street, lined with palm trees and modest coastal homes, was quickly cordoned off with yellow tape. Investigators began a grid search of the interior. They looked for signs of forced entry, blood, or struggle. The house presented a confusing tableau. There were no shattered windows or kicked-in doors to suggest an external intruder. The breach of the gun safe suggested someone who knew where it was and potentially how to access it, or had enough time to force it open without fear of interruption. Forensic technicians began to process the scene. They moved through the kitchen and the living room, dusting for prints and looking for trace evidence. In the initial sweep, the house appeared clean, perhaps too clean. There were subtle irregularities, areas where the flooring looked recently attended to, or where items had been shifted out of their natural alignment. The investigators noted these details, building a picture of the hours leading up to the disappearances. The search radius expanded to the exterior of the property. The backyard of the Mott residence was a typical Florida enclosure, fenced and private. Officers fanned out, their boots moving through the grass, eyes scanning the perimeter for any disturbance. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the lawn, making the detection of ground irregularities difficult. Flashlights were clicked on, their beams cutting through the gathering dusk. Near a fence line, partially obscured by the natural landscaping, an officer noticed a disruption in the earth. The soil here was different, darker, churned, and loose compared to the compacted dirt of the surrounding yard. It was a patch of ground that had been recently turned. The shape was oblong, roughly the dimensions of a human form. The atmosphere in the yard shifted instantly. The urgency of a rescue mission began to bleed into the somber precision of a homicide investigation. Detectives were summoned to the specific patch of earth. They approached with caution, aware that any disturbance of the soil could destroy critical forensic evidence. A shallow grave is a distinct feature in crime scene investigation. It is hasty, often poorly concealed, and indicative of a perpetrator operating under extreme time pressure or physical limitations. The team began the excavation process, using hand trowels to carefully remove the top layers of soil. As the dirt was cleared, the smell of decomposition, though faint due to the recent timeline, began to permeate the air. Within minutes, the digging team encountered resistance. They brushed away the remaining soil to reveal a plastic wrapping. It was a makeshift shroud, buried less than 2 feet beneath the surface. The officers worked in silence, documenting every layer of sediment removal with photography. The shape beneath the plastic was undeniable. The body was exhumed with clinical care. The medical examiner's representative was on site to oversee the removal. When the layers of wrapping were peeled back, the identity of the victim was confirmed. It was Christina French. She had suffered traumatic injuries, consistent with both stabbing and gunshot wounds. The violence inflicted upon her was personal and severe. The discovery of the grandmother in the backyard of her son's home, while her grandson and car were missing, collapsed the possibilities of the case into a singular, horrifying vector. This was no longer a double kidnapping. The grandmother was dead, concealed in a shallow grave that required physical effort to dig. The gun safe had been looted. The car was gone, and Logan Mott was nowhere to be found. The narrative of the missing diabetic child began to warp. While the medical alert for his insulin remained valid, the context had changed entirely. He was now the sole person of interest in the homicide of Christina French. Eric Mott stood at the periphery of this nightmare. The discovery of his mother's body in his own backyard dismantled his reality. The grief was compounded by the implicating evidence pointing toward his son. The investigation moved rapidly from the recovery phase to a manhunt. The description of the Dodge Dart was broadcast nationwide. The license plate number was entered into the NCIC database. The firearms stolen from the safe were flagged, turning the missing teenager into an armed and dangerous subject. Back inside the house, the investigation deepened. With the discovery of the body, the interior was re-examined with a narrower focus. Technicians looked for the primary crime scene. They found evidence of a cleanup. There were faint traces of blood that had been wiped away, attempting to sanitize the violence that had erupted in the domestic space. The timeline began to reconstruct itself. The last verified contact, the time of the flight, and the deceptive text messages Eric had received while away all pointed to a window of time immediately following the murder. The texts, which Eric had read as casual updates from a son to a father, now read as stalling tactics. "I'm fine. We're okay. I'll be home soon." These digital artifacts were not reassurances. They were engineered delays designed to buy time for an escape. The killer had lived in the house with the body, or at least with the knowledge of the body, long enough to clean, to pack, and to formulate a plan. The Neptune Beach detectives coordinated with federal agencies. Since the suspect was a minor and potentially crossing state lines, the scope of the search became federal. They analyzed the potential routes. The car had a head start. The discovery of the body on November 24th meant the perpetrator had a lead of several days. He could be anywhere. The BOLO, be on the lookout, alerts illuminated screens in patrol cars from Florida to the Canadian border. The physical evidence recovered from the grave provided grim clarity. Christina had been buried with a callousness that defied the relationship between grandmother and grandson. The shallow depth suggested a rush, or perhaps the physical exhaustion of a teenage boy struggling with the dead weight of an adult. The location, the backyard, spoke to a lack of transportation at the immediate moment of the crime, or a naive belief that the grave would go unnoticed. As the coroner's van transported Christina French's remains away from Seagull Drive, the house was sealed. It was now a sterile box of evidence. The tragedy was absolute. A mother murdered, a son on the run, and a father left standing in the wreckage of a life that had existed only days before. The search for Logan Mott was no longer a rescue mission for a sick child. It was a pursuit of a fugitive who had armed himself from his father's own arsenal and left his grandmother in the dirt of the family home. The silence of the empty house on Eric's return had been deceptive. The house had been screaming the entire time. As the investigation at the Neptune Beach residence transitioned from a missing persons case to a homicide inquiry, the priority shifted instantly to the location of the silver 2015 Dodge Dart. The vehicle, registered to Christina French, was the primary loose thread in a rapidly unraveling tapestry of violence. What had begun as a silver alert, a notification designed to aid in the recovery of missing elderly persons, morphed into a nationwide "be on the lookout" order. Law enforcement agencies from Florida to the Canadian border were alerted that the driver was likely Logan Mott, a 15-year-old boy armed with service weapons stolen from his father, a corrections lieutenant. The premise of the search was no longer rescue, it was containment. The digital footprint left by the teenager painted a picture of calculated deception rather than panic. In the days leading up to the discovery of the body, Logan had maintained a stream of text messages to his father, Eric Mott. These messages were brief, designed to buy time and deflect suspicion. He claimed to be safe, claimed to be with friends, and repeatedly assured his father that he would be home soon. Each transmission pinged off cell towers that were progressively further north, contradicting the text of the messages. The disconnect between his digital assurances and his physical location provided investigators with a breadcrumb trail leading straight up the Interstate 95 corridor. By Friday, November 24, while forensic teams were still processing the shallow grave on Seagull Drive, the Dodge Dart was over 1,000 miles away. Automated license plate readers and surveillance cameras had captured glimpses of the vehicle cutting through the American Northeast. The timeline suggested a relentless drive, stopping only for fuel and necessities, with the Canadian border as the ultimate objective. The choice of destination revealed a naive desperation common in juvenile offenders who view international lines as magical barriers against domestic law enforcement, failing to account for the rigorous federal scrutiny at entry points. The hunt culminated that evening in Buffalo, New York. The Peace Bridge, a massive steel structure spanning the Niagara River, connects Buffalo to Fort Erie, Ontario. It is a choke point, heavily monitored by U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Around 7 p.m., the silver Dodge Dart entered the approach to the bridge. Reports indicate that Logan Mott may have realized his tactical error too late. The layout of the border crossing does not allow for easy turnarounds. Once a vehicle enters the queue, it is committed to the inspection lanes. There was a moment of vehicular confusion, a wrong turn or a hesitation, that drew immediate attention, but the trap had already snapped shut. The license plate triggered a hit on the national database, flagging the vehicle as stolen and the occupant as a person of interest in a capital murder case involving firearms. Customs and Border Protection officers, alerted to the potential danger, executed a high-risk traffic stop. This was not a routine immigration check. Officers approached the vehicle with weapons drawn, aware that the subject was in possession of a Glock 22 and likely desperate. The tension on the bridge was absolute, the cold wind off Lake Erie whipping around a scene where a single sudden movement could have resulted in a fatal shooting. However, the anticipated firefight did not materialize. Logan Mott complied with commands. He was removed from the vehicle without incident, handcuffed, and taken into federal custody. He appeared slight, looking younger than his 15 years, a stark contrast to the violence of the crime and the heavy weaponry secured from the car. Inside the Dodge Dart, investigators found the physical evidence of the flight. 2 firearms were recovered, consistent with the weapons missing from the Mott residence. Also present was a large knife with apparent biological residue, later confirmed to be consistent with the injuries found on Christina French. The car was a mobile crime scene, cluttered with the detritus of a long-distance escape attempt, food wrappers, energy drinks, and the supplies of an insulin-dependent diabetic who had been managing his condition while fleeing a murder charge. The presence of the insulin was a critical detail. It underscored that Logan had packed with intent, prioritizing his survival needs alongside the instruments of his grandmother's death. Following his detention, Logan was held at the Erie County Youth Services Center. The transition from the adrenaline of the flight to the sterility of a holding cell brought about a disturbing shift in demeanor. Seasoned detectives and federal agents often expect juveniles involved in violent crimes to exhibit signs of immense stress, breakdown, or panic once the reality of their capture sets in. Logan Mott, however, presented a flat affect. His interactions with law enforcement personnel in Buffalo were described as eerily calm. He did not appear to be a child overwhelmed by a tragic mistake. He appeared detached, observing the proceedings with a level of dissociation that unsettled those around him. During the initial processing and subsequent interviews, the narrative Logan attempted to construct was one of confusion and victimization. He did not immediately confess to a premeditated execution. Instead, he offered a fragmented version of events that sought to minimize his culpability. He hinted at an altercation, a moment where things went wrong, suggesting that his actions were a result of snapping under pressure rather than a cold-blooded plan. This claim of snapping was contradicted by the methodical nature of the aftermath, the cleaning of the scene, the burial, the theft of the car, and the deceptive texting. A person in a fugue state of panic rarely manages to navigate 1,000 miles of interstate highway while simultaneously managing a complex web of lies to a law enforcement parent. The confusion he cited seemed tactical. When questioned about the drive, he spoke of the destination as a safe haven, a place where he could restart, betraying a fundamental lack of understanding regarding the extradition treaties between the United States and Canada. He portrayed himself as a boy lost in a situation that had spiraled out of control, yet his physical actions, the burial and the flight, were the choices of someone attempting to control the outcome. The interrogation room dynamic was skewed. Investigators were speaking to a boy who looked like a middle schooler, but who had acted with the lethality of an adult offender. This period of detention in New York was critical for the psychological profile of the suspect. It was here that the smirk began to manifest not necessarily a smile of joy, but a facial expression of arrogance or perhaps nervous detachment that would later define his public image. In the absence of tears or visible remorse, his neutral expression was interpreted by authorities as coldness. He waived his extradition rights, a legal move that expedited his return to Florida, but he did so with a nonchalance that belied the gravity of facing a first-degree murder charge. He seemed to view the legal proceedings as a puzzle to be navigated rather than a judgment on a moral atrocity. The narrative he provided to the Buffalo authorities attempted to frame the killing as a tragedy that happened to him, rather than one he engineered. He spoke of the grandmother he killed not as an enemy, but as a collateral figure in his own internal crisis. This dissociation was potent. He could acknowledge the death while refusing to emotionally accept the role of the murderer. The "I'll be home soon" texts he had sent to his father were explained away as necessary stalls, stripped of the emotional cruelty they inflicted on a father worrying about his missing son and mother. To Logan, they were tactical tools. To the investigators, they were proof of a sound, manipulative mind. As preparations began to transport him back to Duval County, the disconnect between his appearance and his actions became the central focus of the case's media narrative. The public saw a photo of a clean-cut, bespectacled boy who looked like he belonged in a choir, yet the police reports described a suspect who buried his grandmother and drove to Canada with a stolen Glock. The capture at the bridge had secured the suspect, but it had opened a terrifying window into the psyche of a killer who could commit matricide one day and calmly negotiate a border crossing the next. The interrogation yielded facts, but it failed to yield the one thing investigators looked for, a sign that Logan Mott understood the permanence of what he had done. He remained, in those first days of custody, chillingly composed. O had allegedly executed his grandmother, with a combination of gunshots and stab wounds, was now in custody, yet the geographical distance between the arrest in Buffalo and the crime scene in Neptune Beach offered only a temporary pause in the legal proceedings. The extradition process began immediately, stripping Logan Mott of the anonymity he had sought near the Canadian border. He was no longer a missing child. He was a capital murder suspect. The transition from the shivering cold of the New York border to the humid familiarity of Florida marked the end of his flight and the beginning of a grim procedural reality. Upon his return to Duval County, the 15-year-old was booked into the very system his father, Eric Mott, had served for years as a corrections lieutenant. The intake process produced a mugshot that would ignite a firestorm of public vitriol. In the photograph, Logan appeared to be faintly smiling, a subtle, closed-mouth expression that many observers interpreted as a smirk. This image, plastered across news stations and social media feeds, stood in grotesque contrast to the brutality of the crime. Christina French buried in a shallow grave, shot and stabbed, while her grandson drove her car across the country. The public did not see a nervous child or a diabetic suffering from blood sugar irregularities. They saw arrogance. They saw a killer who seemed pleased with himself. This single frame defined the early narrative of the legal proceedings, fueling a demand for maximum punishment before a single piece of evidence was presented in court. The legal strategy began to take shape as the Public Defender's Office assumed representation. The seriousness of the offense was underscored when a grand jury indicted the teenager on a charge of first-degree murder. In Florida, this charge carries a mandatory penalty of life in prison, though the United States Supreme Court rulings regarding juveniles, specifically Miller v. Alabama, meant that a mandatory life sentence without parole was unconstitutional for a minor. However, a discretionary life sentence remained a distinct possibility. The defense faced an uphill battle. The physical evidence was overwhelming: the body in the yard, the weapon in the car, the blood in the home, and the electronic trail of deception. Their only viable path was to contextualize the violence, to paint Logan not as a cold-blooded sociopath, but as a troubled adolescent whose undiagnosed mental health issues and unmanaged type 1 diabetes had created a perfect storm of cognitive failure. For months, the legal teams sparred over motions and mental health evaluations. The defense argued that Logan had been subjected to bullying and was suffering from deep depression. They suggested that his blood sugar levels at the time of the killing may have contributed to a psychotic break, rendering him unable to control his impulses. The prosecution, however, remained focused on the timeline. They pointed to the methodical nature of the aftermath. Logan had not called 911 inches a panic after snapping. He had cleaned the scene. He had hidden the body. He had packed a bag. He had navigated across state lines. These were the actions of a rational, preservation-minded individual, not someone in the throes of a diabetic delirium. To avoid the gamble of a jury trial where the graphic details of Christina French's death would be displayed in high definition, and where a life sentence was a statistical probability, the defense sought a negotiated resolution. The state, acknowledging Logan's youth and the wish of the victim's son, Logan's father, to avoid further trauma, agreed to a plea deal. Logan Mott would plead guilty to second-degree murder. This reduced charge removed the certainty of a life sentence but still exposed him to a massive prison term. The agreement capped the maximum sentence at 40 years and set the minimum at 15. The wide range meant that the ultimate decision would rest solely with the presiding judge, Bruce Anderson. The sentencing hearing arrived with a palpable tension. The courtroom was packed, the gallery divided between support for a grieving father and the community's demand for justice. When Logan Mott entered, the smirk was gone. He looked smaller, younger, and visibly shaken. The arrogance that the public had projected onto him from his booking photo had evaporated, replaced by the trembling demeanor of a teenager facing the reality of growing old in a cage. The emotional anchor of the hearing was the testimony of Eric Mott. Standing before the court, he embodied a conflict that few could comprehend. He was the son of the victim and the father of the murderer. He spoke of his mother, Christina, describing her as a saintly figure who had dedicated her life to helping others, including Logan. He spoke of his son not as a monster, but as a boy who had lost his way. In a statement that silenced the room, Eric Mott asked the judge for leniency. He told the court that he had forgiven his son. He argued that losing his mother was a tragedy he would carry forever, but losing his son to a life behind bars would only compound that tragedy. He pleaded for a sentence that would allow Logan a chance at redemption, a chance to eventually return to society and contribute something positive. When it was Logan's turn to speak, The composure he had maintained during his flight to the border completely collapsed. He stood, weeping, struggling to get the words out. He addressed his father and the rest of his family, apologizing for the pain he had caused. He claimed he did not know why he did it, that he couldn't remember the exact moments of the violence, and that he wished he could take it back. "I am so sorry," he sobbed, his voice breaking. He insisted that he loved his grandmother and that the person who committed those acts was not the true Logan. However, the tears and the apologies did not have the mitigating effect the defense might have hoped for. Judge Bruce Anderson sat stone-faced, listening to the pleas for mercy. When the time came for him to render his decision and explain his reasoning, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted from sorrow to severity. Judge Anderson was not swayed by the narrative of a momentary lapse in judgment. He looked at the evidence, and he saw calculation. In his blistering sentencing remarks, Judge Anderson systematically dismantled the defense's portrayal of a confused child. He focused intently on the actions taken after Christina French was dead. He noted that Logan had not just killed his grandmother, he had erased her from the home. He had wrapped her body. He had dug a hole in the sandy soil of the backyard under the cover of darkness. He had cleaned the blood. Then, most damning of all, he had assumed her digital identity. The judge cited the text messages sent to Eric Mott, the assurances that everything was fine, the promises that he would be home soon. These were not the actions of a boy in a diabetic fog. They were the tactical maneuvers of a killer buying time. Judge Anderson addressed the smirk directly, not as a facial expression, but as an attitude reflected in the crime itself. The audacity to drive the victim's car, to use her money, and to lie to her son while she lay in a shallow grave spoke to a criminal sophistication that belied Logan's age. The judge acknowledged the mental health arguments, but found them insufficient to explain the prolonged, multi-day cover-up. He stated that while the law required him to consider Logan's youth, the safety of the community and the severity of the crime required a substantial penalty. The judge's tone made it clear. The smiling boy from the mugshot was now facing the full weight of the state. Anderson characterized the murder as heinous, atrocious, and cruel. He pointed out that Christina French was a caregiver, a woman who had shown Logan nothing but love, and her reward was to be shot and stabbed by the very child she was protecting. The betrayal was absolute. With the gallery holding its breath, Judge Bruce Anderson pronounced the sentence. He did not choose the minimum of 15 years, nor did he choose the absolute maximum of 40 without condition. He sentenced Logan Mott to 15 to 40 years in prison. The structure of the sentence meant that the Department of Corrections would determine the exact release date based on behavior and rehabilitation. But the message was clear. Logan would spend the entirety of his young adulthood, and likely his middle age, incarcerated. He was also ordered to serve probation upon release, ensuring that the state would monitor him long after he left prison walls. The reality of the sentence washed over the courtroom. For Eric Mott, it was a mixed verdict. His son was not lost forever to a life sentence, yet the separation would be decades long. The judge had essentially wiped the slate clean of any notion that this was a mere juvenile delinquency case. As the deputies moved to handcuff Logan and lead him out of the courtroom, the teenager looked back at his father. The arrogance was gone. The tactical manipulation was gone. All that remained was a prisoner, facing a future defined by concrete walls and regret. Following the hearing, Eric Mott spoke to the press, maintaining his stance of forgiveness and tragic acceptance. He reiterated that he loved his son and would support him through the incarceration, but he also acknowledged the justice in the judge's decision. The legal reckoning had concluded. The case that began with a missing grandmother and a deceptive text message ended with a gavel strike that affirmed the dual nature of the tragedy. One life ended in violence, another halted by justice, leaving a father to mourn them both in the quiet aftermath of the courtroom.